The wind carried the smell of coal smoke and thawed manure, a bitter perfume, over the muddy ruts of the main road. Spring was trying to claw its way back into the valley, but the snow kept returning in mean little squalls, biting through cotton dresses and old coats. Nora stood at the edge of the butcher's awning with her baby swaddled against her chest, watching the townsfolk pretend she wasn't there. The two older children clung to her skirt like burrs. She didn't scold them for it. She had come out for a slab of meat, just a cheap cut to boil down with whatever roots she could dig up behind the church, but the man behind the counter wouldn't look her in the eye. "Nothing left," he said too quickly. She could see the haunches hanging behind him, red and gleaming in the lamplight, but she didn't argue. Pride was a luxury for women with someone to speak for them. Her fingers ached as she turned the buggy around, sledging through slush toward the shack she'd been given on the far end of town, the one with a sagging roof and no latch on the door. The town called it charity. She knew better. Every man in Larkspur knew her story. Not all the details, but enough to know she wasn't wanted. Word had traveled faster than the train that brought her here last winter. Deserted, widowed, foolish enough to bear 3 little ones for a man who never married her. That was all they needed. The baby stirred against her chest, letting out a dry cough that rasped too deep for comfort. She rubbed his back with a cracked palm, murmuring nothing words to hush him. The other two hadn't spoken all morning. Even the youngest had learned silence was safer. The road bent away from town past the blacksmith's and the mill. That was when she saw him. A man alone by the fence line, bracing against the wind. He was tall but crooked at the shoulder, like a tree split by lightning and left to grow anyway. His hat was low over his face coat, patched and soaked through. There was something hard about the way he stood. Not unkind, just used up. Nora didn't mean to stop, but the boy tugged her skirt and pointed. The man had turned his head. He was watching them, not with pity, not with the wary coldness she knew too well, just watching. They passed each other like that. No words, no change in step, just a glance that felt like something being noticed after a long winter buried under snow. She didn't look back. That night, after she'd fed the children a thin stew and packed them into bed, she sat by the window with a blanket around her shoulders. The wind howled against the shutters, finding the cracks in the boards. Her fingers traced the stitches in the baby's quilt, each one sewn in a different town. Each one from a version of herself she barely remembered. She hadn't cried in weeks, not since the last letter came back unopened. But that night, staring into the dark beyond the window, she let herself feel the weight of it. Not just the hunger, the cold, the shame, but the quiet ache of being unseen, of being a woman whose story had already been told, whose ending had already been written by someone else's hand. The wind settled. Somewhere far off a horse snorted and stamped. A barn door creaked open. Then, quiet again. She closed her eyes, pressing her cheek against the wood. "Just let them be all right," she whispered. That's all. She didn't know she would see the man again, or that he'd speak, or that he'd do something no one else in Larkspur had dared. She didn't know what it would cost him, or her. But the ice had cracked just a little, and something waited underneath. The next morning came pale and sharp, with frost on the windows and a brittle sky. Nora boiled what was left of the bones, scraping the grease off the top to save for the baby's lips. She wrapped the children in wool and set them to sorting dry kindling, then stepped outside with the wash basin tucked under one arm. The pump behind the church had frozen again. She stood there a moment, staring at the stiff iron handle, breath curling from her mouth. Her hands were raw, and her boots were splitting at the toes. Something in her wavered, then stiffened. She turned and started walking. Across the road, past the rows of shuttered houses, past the postmaster's window and the dress shop with its bright calicos she'd never afford. She didn't think about who might see her. She walked straight into town with her head down and her jaw tight. And there he was again, by the livery this time, wrestling a stubborn sorrel mare into the yard. His coat was dusted white from the fence line. He grunted and swore under his breath, not cruelly, just like a man who didn't bother pretending the world listened. He glanced up when he saw her. She hesitated. She hadn't meant to come this way. He wiped his hand on his pants, then nodded once. "Morning." She nodded back. He didn't look away. Her arms tightened around the wash basin. The pumps froze. He shifted his weight like he hadn't expected her to speak. "Ain't surprised. Pipes are shallow here. Sun'll warm it by noon, maybe." She waited, unsure why she hadn't walked on. He looked down at the basin. "You need water." She nodded. That was all. He jerked his chin toward the barn. "Got a spring tap in back. Not far. If you want." She could feel herself bristle, that old tension winding up inside her. No good ever came from a man offering favors. But there was no leer in his voice, no shift in his stance. Just a simple offer. "All right," she said finally. She followed him around the side where an old wooden spout dripped into a trough. He handed her a tin ladle. She bent to fill her basin, her sleeves dipping wet at the wrists. He stood back, watching the trees instead of her. She liked that. "Thank you," she said when it was done. He gave a slow nod as if the words meant something. Then she turned to go. He called after her low, "Name's Eli." She stopped. He waited. She looked over her shoulder. "Nora." Something passed between them then. Not a smile, not yet. But a shift. A softening. She went home with the basin full and her throat tight. That night she found the eldest boy staring out the window. "What are you looking for?" she asked. He shrugged. "The man with the horse." She swallowed. "He's just someone from town. He don't look at us like the others." She pulled him close, tucked his hair behind his ear. "Go on now. Lie down." But after they were asleep, she sat by the stove and thought of the way Eli had stood quiet, sure like he knew something about being watched and not seen. She thought of how he hadn't asked where her husband was, and how he hadn't looked away. Ride through the quiet, subscribe and stay. The days came longer after that, though the wind still rattled through the bones of the town like it wanted to finish what winter had started. Nora kept to herself as she always had, but something had loosened inside her. Not softer exactly, just less brittle. The second time she saw him, he was hauling fence posts in a cart behind that same stubborn sorrel. His shoulder looked worse in the light, twisted slightly forward like it had never set right, but he worked with a quiet rhythm, as if he'd made peace with it. She didn't mean to speak. But as she passed him near the edge of town, her mouth opened. "Fixin' pasture." He blinked at her, then nodded. "Old McLean lets me keep the mare if I help mend his fence." "Fair trade." She nodded too. The wind gusted, tossing her shawl. She held it close. He squinted toward her arms. "You carryin' the baby?" She adjusted the cloth. "Always. I got a sling. Army issue. Still strong. You could tie it crosswise, save your back." She wasn't used to such plain concern. It caught her off guard. He must seen the hesitation in her face. "No charge," he said. "Ain't like I got use for it anymore." She looked down the road, then back at him. "All right." He set the bundle aside that evening just inside the broken fence at the edge of her yard. Said nothing, just tipped his hat when she found it and walked on. That's how it began. Not with declarations, not with flowers or fine dinners, but with quiet acts that no one else offered her. A split of kindling left near her door. A bit of salve for the baby's cough. Shared silence at the pump when her hands were too cold to work the ladle. She learned things in pieces. That he'd ridden with the cavalry back before the war turned sour. That he'd come home to a ranch gone under and no one left to claim him? That he'd lived alone since then, mostly outside town, on the land he cleared himself. He didn't speak of the shoulder. She didn't ask. One afternoon she passed him at the mill where she sometimes did laundry for pennies. Her hands were red and shaking raw from the lye soap. He didn't ask what she'd earned. Just walked with her part way home, his gait stiff but steady. "You been here long?" he asked, not looking at her. "Since Christmas." "You got folks?" She shook her head. "He brought me here. Said he had work. Then he left." Eli nodded like that made sense to him. "Men do that." She stopped walking. "I didn't think he would." He stopped too. She looked at him. "I wouldn't have come if I knew." He waited silent. "I got no papers. No name but mine. And 3 little mouths. You feed 'em," he said. She blinked. "That's what matters. They don't care what the town says." The wind tugged at her shawl again. She didn't fix it this time. She just looked at him. "You don't talk much," she said. He shrugged with one good shoulder. "Most folks talk too much." She laughed. Not loud. Just enough to surprise herself. That night, after the children were asleep, she found the sling folded neatly beside the door. Heavy canvas, worn but clean. She held it in her lap a while before wrapping the baby into it. He settled in deeper than he ever had in her arms, warm and still. She didn't cry, but something softened. A knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying loosened just a little. Out the window, the moon lit the frost on the grass. It shimmered like glass. She could almost imagine the world was gentle. Almost. The thaw came sudden, as it often did. One day the ground was packed hard with old ice, and the next it ran slick with mud and meltwater. Trees along the ridge bared their limbs like old men waking from sleep, and the river hissed as it cracked its shell. Nora began taking in more work, mending, washing, anything she could do while keeping the children close. The eldest helped where he could, learning to split wood, learning to be still when he had to. The baby's cough eased. The girl started humming to herself again, soft and shy. Eli came by more often, though he never stepped inside. He fixed the door latch without being asked. Left a stack of hickory logs that burned clean. Once, when he found the roof dripping, he patched it with tar paper and old shingles before the storm could soak through. Still, he never stayed long. They spoke little, but when they did, it was easy. Like two people who didn't mind the quiet. One afternoon, as she walked back from the creek with a basket of wet clothes, she found him standing near the edge of her yard. No horse this time. He was holding a small wooden box. She eyed it warily. "What's that?" "Something for the kids," he said without much ceremony. "Found it in a drawer I hadn't opened in years." She set the basket down slow. "You didn't have to." He shrugged. "Didn't say I had to." She opened the box. Inside were a handful of wooden animals, rough carved, the kind that bore marks of a younger man's patience. A horse, a cow, a dog with one ear too big. Her daughter gasped when she saw. The boy took the horse without a word and carried it to the porch like it was made of gold. Nora's hands tightened on the edge of the box. "Yours?" she asked. He nodded. "Made him for a nephew. Before." He didn't finish the sentence. "She didn't make him." She looked at him for a long moment, her heart pinched tight and uncertain. "You lost him." He looked away. "I lost most things." She could have said she understood. But some kinds of sorrow don't need to be matched. So she just stood there holding the box. The girl tugged on her skirt. "Can he stay for supper?" Nora blinked. Eli didn't move. She looked at him. His eyes were steady, waiting for her to decide. She hesitated only a second. "If you want," she said. He nodded once. "All right." That night he sat at their table. Not like a man claiming space, but like one waiting to be sure it was truly offered. The children were wild with joy, showing him every scrap of paper they'd drawn on, every dented spoon they'd turned into a toy. He listened like it mattered. Nora moved quietly around the stove, fixing cornmeal, mush, and boiled greens. She set the food down, then sat across from him. Halfway through the meal, the girl curled into his side without asking. He stiffened at first, then relaxed. Slowly, one arm came up around her. The baby was quiet. The boy watched Eli like he was memorizing him. After the children were asleep, Eli stood at the door. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me stay." She shook her head. "They were happy. And you?" She looked at him, then full and clear. "I don't know yet. But I didn't feel so alone." He touched the brim of his hat. "That's something." Then he walked off into the dark, his boots slow in the damp grass until she couldn't hear him anymore. Nora stayed by the door a while longer. Not waiting, just listening. The wind had gone still. For the first time in months, the night didn't feel like it was trying to take something from her. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them spoke aloud. He came by once or twice a week, always with a purpose, a hinge to fix a tool, to lend a pail of milk from the ranch on the other side of the ridge. She never asked for these things, and he never made her feel as if she owed him. Sometimes he'd stay a little longer, enough to shell beans on the stoop while the children played in the dirt. They'd talk about the weather mostly, or how the frost had ruined half the early plantings. Safe things, surface things. But sometimes late in the day, when the shadows stretched long and the baby slept on her chest, they'd sit in that fading quiet and let the deeper truths bleed through the edges. One evening she found him standing at the edge of the pasture behind her place, watching the trees sway under a low gray sky. She came up beside him, arms folded tight against the chill. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "I used to. And now I got a place to stand." She studied his face, the hard-cut lines of it, the way his eyes stayed fixed on something just beyond the trees. She wanted to ask what held him here, but she already knew. "I thought I'd be married by now," she said. "Properly. House with a gate. A man who spoke plain and worked steady." "You still could be," he said quietly. She looked down. "Not in this town." He didn't argue. A breeze kicked up, stirring the grass. She spoke without thinking. "He left us in the station. Told me he'd wired a man about work. Said he'd be back in 2 days. I waited nearly a week before I realized there was no job, no letter. Just a ticket he never paid for and a woman no one wanted to take in." Eli was quiet for a long while. "You waited," he said at last. "I didn't know what else to do." He nodded like he understood that kind of waiting. The slow bleed of hope, the ache of stubborn belief. She watched him for a moment. "What about you? What about me? You never married." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Once. A long time ago." "What happened?" "She died." There was no softness in the way he said it, just truth. Unflinching. Nora lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I loved her. That's more than most men get." She felt the words settle inside her like stones in water. They stood there a while, two people shaped by grief and hardened by survival, neither trying to fill the silence. The wind combed through the grass like fingers through a child's hair. Then slowly she reached out and touched the back of his hand. Not holding, just touching. His fingers didn't move, but he didn't pull away. Later that night, when she lay in bed beside the baby, she thought of the way his eyes had stayed on hers. Steady. Sure, he hadn't promised her anything, but for the first time she didn't feel ashamed of wanting. The next Sunday brought trouble, though it came quiet at first. Nora had taken the children to the edge of the chapel yard where wildflowers grew stubborn through the frost-gnawed ground. She didn't go in, not since the pastor's wife had made it plain she wasn't welcome with her bastard children, and no ring to show for it. But she still believed in reverence and stillness and teaching her children to listen for things they couldn't always see. The youngest was toddling after a beetle when Nora saw them, two women near the water barrel whispering behind bent hands. One had her face turned just enough for Nora to catch her name, Mrs. Tilson, whose boy worked at the feed store. The other woman glanced Nora's way, then leaned in closer. Nora looked down at her skirt. It was patched but clean. The baby's face was wiped, the girl's braids neat. Still, her heart curled in on itself. Later that afternoon, as she washed linens on the back stoop, the girl from the dress shop came by. Flushed cheeks, nervous smile. "You might want to know," she said, "they've been talking about you." Nora didn't stop scrubbing. "They always do. This time it's worse." The girl hesitated, then spoke quickly. "Someone said you've been letting that old ranch hand sleep in your house." Nora looked up, then cold and sharp. "That's a lie." "I know, but they're saying it. That you're trying to catch a man again. Trap him with your children. That maybe he's not the first." Nora's breath caught. "What business is it of theirs?" "They think it is, because they don't like the way he looks at you." She stood there, fists wet and shaking. "He's kind. That's all?" The girl nodded. "That's more than most men are. But be careful, Nora. They don't forgive kindness from people like us." When she told Eli the next evening, his face went still. The kind of still that came before a storm. "I can talk to him," he said. "No." She touched his arm. "That'll only make it worse. They already think you owe them something." He looked away, jaw tight. "You want me to stay away?" The question struck deeper than she expected. She shook her head slowly. "No. I just want it to stop." He nodded, but she saw the weight settle in his shoulders, like he blamed himself. The next week, the grocer shorted her on eggs. The landlord mentioned she ought to start paying for the well water, even though he hadn't said a word all winter. Her sewing work dried up. Mrs. Tilson's boy wouldn't even look her way. It came slow, like a creeping frost. Not outright cruelty, just the quiet kind that made it clear you didn't belong. That night, Eli came by with a sack of cornmeal and a small sack of beans. He didn't say where they came from. She didn't ask. He set them on the table, then stood in the doorway, staring at the children as they played. "I could leave," he said. "Go north. There's a railroad crew looking for help past Fairbury." Nora turned from the stove. Her chest tightened. "Why would you do that?" His eyes didn't meet hers. "They'd leave you alone. If I wasn't here." It was a kind of offer, a kind of protection. But it felt like the start of goodbye. She crossed the room, quiet. "If you leave, they win. And I lose the only good thing I've got here." He met her gaze then. For a long moment, neither looked away. "I don't want to be another man who leaves," he said. "Then don't." He exhaled slowly, like something inside him let go. They stood there side by side as the lantern flickered low. The world could say what it wanted. Let them whisper. He was still here. So was she. The rain came heavy that Friday, turning the yard to mud and washing the soot off rooftops like gilt scraped raw. The sky hung low all afternoon, gray and shapeless, pressing down on the town like it meant to crush whatever softness was left in it. Nora sat by the window, the baby asleep against her chest, listening to the slow drip from the eaves. Eli hadn't come that day. She told herself he'd been held up by the rain or the workout past the ridge, but something in her stomach twisted all the same. The knock at the door came hard and sudden. She moved fast, shielding the baby's head with one hand, hard hammering as she opened it. It wasn't Eli. It was Mr. Keene, the deputy, though folks rarely called him that unless there was something that needed intimidating. He stood soaked through in his slick coat, eyes already scanning the room behind her. "Ma'am," he said, voice cool. "Need a word." She stepped out, pulling the door near closed behind her. "What is it?" "There's been talk." "About you?" "About the man keeps visitin'. Some folks say it ain't proper." She squared her shoulders. "What business is that of yours?" He leaned in, breath sour. "When it unsettles good folk, it becomes mine. We got order in this town. Don't need drifters stirring up sympathy where it don't belong. He hasn't done a thing wrong." Keene grinned, mean and small. "Doesn't matter. All it takes is the wrong man listening to the wrong woman. Could make trouble for both of you." She clenched her teeth. "If you're here to threaten me, you should go ahead and say it. I'm just warning you." He tipped his hat, mock courteous. "Some folks think charity's fine. Others think you're taking advantage. Wouldn't want to find yourself out on the edge of town with no help at all." She didn't answer. He stepped back. "Best keep to yourself. And keep him away." When she shut the door, her hands were shaking. She bolted it for the first time in weeks. That night, she waited. After the children were down, after the rain stopped, after the lamps in town had all gone dim. Still no sign of him. It was near midnight when she heard the tap at the window. She opened the door and pulled him in, fast cold water trailing off his coat, his hair slicked to his brow. "I heard," he said. She nodded, her voice caught. "He came here." "Keene's a coward," Eli muttered. "Just enough badge to make him dangerous. They're trying to push us out." He looked around the small room, the lopsided table, the fire barely burning, the baby curled in the sling against her chest. Then he looked at her. Like he was seeing everything at once. "You should come with me," he said. "What?" "I got a place out past Pine Hollow. It's rough, but it's mine. We could fix it up. There's land for planting. A spring. No one out there to run you off." She stared at him, the offer cracking something open deep in her chest. "It's not just me," she said. "I know. You'd have to share everything." "I want to." Her hands trembled at her sides. "Why?" He stepped closer. "Because you stayed. Because you fight for what matters. Because when I see you with those children, I remember what it means to try." She didn't cry. "Not yet." But her voice broke. "And what if we fail? What if it's worse out there?" His hand found hers. "Then we fail together. I'm not walking away." She nodded. "Once. Then again." He left just before dawn to prepare the cabin to clear the road. When the light came up soft and pink over the valley, she began packing what little they had. There was no more waiting. The past had taken enough from both of them. Now came the hard part. The good part. The start of something they could build with their own hands. They left before sunup, before the town could see them go. Nora wrapped the children tight in wool and canvas, tied what little they owned into 2 flour sacks, and tucked the smallest toys into the baby's sling, wooden animals, worn smooth by small hands. The boy carried a pot with their last bit of cornmeal. The girl walked close, always touching her mother's coat, eyes wide but silent. Eli met them at the edge of the trees where the road turned soft with pine needles. His mare was saddled, a second rope pulling a flat cart made of old fence rails. It wasn't much, but it rolled, and the blankets inside were warm. He didn't say anything. Just helped the children into the cart, gave Nora a long look, and nodded once. They walked. It was nearly 4 hours through the hollow where spring had come sooner, and the snowmelt pooled in muddy ditches. The land out there was quieter, less carved by men's hands. Pines stood tall and thick, the underbrush low but wild. Deer tracks crossed their path. Birds returned to branches like forgotten songs. The cabin sat on a rise roof, slanted boards weathered gray. a lean-to on one side, a rusted stovepipe poking out like a finger pointing nowhere. It looked like it had grown there, not been built. Ellie cleared his throat. Ain't much, but it's dry. Nora stepped inside. The air was cold and clean. The floor was swept. A cot in one corner, a shelf of tin dishes, a barrel of well water beside the door. Through a back window she could see a clearing, flat land, good light space to plant. The girl tugged at her skirt. Can we stay? Nora looked at Eli. He said nothing. Just watched her same way he always did, like he'd wait as long as it took. She nodded. Yes. That night they cooked over the fire. Just beans and boiled cornmeal, but it tasted like peace. The baby curled in her lap. The older two fell asleep tangled together on the cot. She sat on a wooden crate by the hearthcoat, still wrapped tight, watching the flames throw soft light against the log walls. Eli was by the door, sharpening a blade that didn't need sharpening. You ever think this would happen? She asked. He gave a half smile. Didn't think much about anything. Until you. That stunned her more than anything else had. She turned toward him, voice quiet. I don't know what to give you. You already gave it. What? Your trust. He set the knife down. I spent a long time thinking the only thing I had to offer was quiet. That if I stayed out of the way, maybe the world wouldn't take any more from me. His eyes met hers. You reminded me that living's not the same as hiding. Nora's throat tightened. I don't want to hide any more either. They sat in that silence for a long time. When she finally reached for his hand, he took it gently, held it like something precious. Outside, the wind passed soft through the trees. The night no longer pressed in. It cradled them instead like a hand-sheltering flame. They had no neighbors, no sermons, no whispers. Just a cabin, a fire, and a chance. The weeks that followed were hard in the way honest things are, bone-tired, blistered, hand-hard. But they were not cruel. Eli rose before dawn every day, cut and stacked wood until the sore in his shoulder lit fire. Nora learned the land quickly, what roots to boil, how deep to dig before the soil turned too wet. She gathered moss for warmth, mended torn sleeves, and taught the children to wash in the stream where the water ran shallow and clean. The boy followed Eli everywhere, watched how he moved, how he listened before speaking, how he didn't waste words or kindness. One morning Ellie showed him how to set a snare. You wait, he said. You don't chase what you need. You make space for it. The boy nodded like he understood more than he was supposed to. Nora watched from the tree-line, arms folded, a knot of fear and gratitude caught under her ribs. She'd meant this place to be a stopgap, a hiding place. But the land didn't feel borrowed. It felt like it had been waiting. At night she and Eli shared the cot back to back at first. Careful, quiet. Then one evening when the wind howled so loud through the walls that even the girl began to cry, Eli reached for her in the dark and pulled her close. Neither spoke, but her body folded into his like it had always belonged there. That night, for the first time in too long, she dreamed of nothing. In the days that followed, they worked like something depended on them. Not survival, not reputation, but the kind of future built with purpose. Eli turned one of the lean toes into a henhouse. Nora dug a trench for planting. They started to speak of seasons, not weeks. Of fences to build. Of a second cot for the children. One day he came back from the ridge carrying a satchel and a paper bag. What's that? She asked, wiping her hands on her apron. He opened the bag slowly. Inside was a small sack of flour, a piece of salt pork, a jar of pickled beans, and a paper folded neat. She opened it. A deed, scrawled and rough but signed. His name, this land, a promise. Her throat caught. I wanted you to know it's real, he said. Not just words. She stared at the paper, then back at him. You did this for me. For all of you. I want you to have more than safety. I want you to belong. She pressed the paper to her chest, blinking fast. I do, she whispered. I do belong. Here. With you. He reached for her hand. Then stay. I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the girl chased the baby in circles, while the boy dragged a broken branch toward the firewood pile. The sky stretched wide and pale, full of new buds and morning birdsong. Home didn't always come with a roof or a ring. Sometimes it came with scraped knees, mended sleeves, and two people choosing each other in the quiet again and again. By late summer, the land had begun to answer them. Green pushed up where Nora had cut the rows crooked and shallow. Beans climbed the rough trellis Ellie built from saplings. The hens scratched and laid, and the children learned the sound of each egg settling warm into a basket. The cabin smelled of smoke and bread and sun-dried clothes. It was never quiet, not truly, but it was steady. Trouble came anyway. It always did. One afternoon, when the sky burned white with heat, a horse came down the narrow track. Nora saw the dust first, then the shape of a man riding stiff and upright like he meant to be seen. Eli stepped out from the shed, hand resting easy at his side. Nora brought the children inside without being told. The rider reined in hard. Deputy Keene slid down, boots hitting dirt like a challenge. So this is where you ran off to, he said, eyes skimming the land with thin contempt. Living outside the law now. Eli didn't rise to it. What do you want? Keene pulled a folded paper from his coat. Town's got concerns. Woman with no husband. Man with no fixed employment. Children born out of wedlock. He smiled. Could call it neglect. Nora came to the door then. She didn't hide behind it. They're fed, she said. They're warm. They're loved. Keene's eyes slid to her belly, flat still, then to Eli. Love don't count for much on paper. Eli stepped forward, slow and careful. That land's mine. Deeds filed. Keene's smile faltered. And she's with me, Eli said. By choice. Silence stretched. Cicadas buzzed loud in the trees. Keene spat into the dirt. Town won't forget this. Town already did, Nora said. Keene mounted up without another word and rode back the way he'd come, dust settling behind him like a door closing. That night, Eli sat on the step, elbows on his knees. Nora joined him, setting a tin cup into his hands. You didn't have to face him, she said. Yes, he said. I did. She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of the old injury. He shifted, then relaxed into it. I don't want to be afraid anymore, she said. You aren't, he replied. You stood your ground. She smiled into his shirt. I learned from you. Autumn came gentle. Leaves turned and fell. The children grew strong and loud. The girl lost her shyness. The boy lost his fear of sleep. The baby learned to walk, holding the table, laughing when he fell. One morning, Eli came back from the creek with something wrapped in cloth. He waited until the children were outside before he opened it. Inside were two plain rings. Hammered silver. Uneven. Honest. I didn't have much, he said. But I made them. Nora stared. I ain't asking because I need you, he said, voice steady but low. I'm asking because I want you. And I want them. He swallowed. I want a life where we choose each other every day. She didn't answer right away. She reached for his injured hand, turned it over, traced the scarred skin with her thumb. I won't promise easy, she said. I won't ask for it. I won't promise to stop being afraid. I'll stand with you anyway. She slid the ring onto his finger. It fit. Then he slid hers on. Outside, the children whooped and ran circles around the cabin when they saw them laughing and crying all at once. They didn't marry in town. No preacher. No witnesses but trees and sky and the creek running sure and steady. Ellie spoke first. Nora followed. Simple words. Chosen words. That winter the snow came heavy, but the roof held. The fire stayed lit. Nora woke one night with Eli's hand on her belly, warm and certain. She smiled into the dark. Spring would come again, and whatever came with it, they would meet it together. If this tale rode with you, subscribe and continue.